Hi there. In this video, I'll be talking about human evolution as well as the human genome. Humans have been on Earth, at least Homo sapiens, for about 200,000 years. But other ancestors of humans first appeared several million years ago. I'll talk about some of those ancestors and some general aspects of human evolution and the spread of hominins throughout the world. So on this general phylogram, Homo sapiens is out here. We've already talked about a couple of animals. One was Cenorhabditis elegans and the other was Drosophila melanogaster, and then talked about Saccharomyces and the fungi and a couple of plants back here. Like most animals, humans exhibit a great deal of diversity and genetic variability. So these are just some pictures of people from around the world, and you can see the morphological differences among them. This figure up here is a map showing the distribution of different pigmentations throughout the world. So you can see there's a great deal of variability there. A lot of that is related to the original inheritance of those characters, as well as where those humans originally evolved. And even among Africans, there's quite a bit of variation in the pigmentation, as you can see by the map. Also, Africa has the highest overall genetic diversity of any continent. The map on the lower right is percent of the population with red hair in the British Isles. And so that shows you that in northern England, where some of my ancestors are from, there is a high proportion of red-headed people. And I show these two maps mainly to show you that in a broad range, there's a lot of diversity in humans, and even in a narrower geographic range, there's quite a bit of variation among the morphological types in different parts of the world. Here's a breakdown of the human genome. The total genome is about 3.7 billion nucleotides. For the haploid, for the 1C level. If you look at different studies, they range from anywhere from 3.2 to 3.9 billion. So it depends on who was doing the sequencing and what the final numbers were. There are between 150 and 2,300 ribosomal RNA genes, 497 tRNA genes, 97 SNO RNA genes, small nuclear organizing RNAs, which process the ribosomal RNAs as well as other RNAs, and greater than 75 spliceosomal RNA genes for splicing. And splicing turns out to be very important in the human genome. If you look down here at the total number of genes, those range from about 23,000 to about 30,000, depending again on who's doing the sequencing and the annotation. But those genes can actually produce over 90,000 different proteins. And a lot of the differences are in because of alternative splicing of the mRNAs to make different proteins. If the human genome is compared with the Saccharomyces cerevisiae genome, that is yeast, then yeast has about 5,800 genes. The human genome has about 29,000 genes, so about 5 times as many more genes, which encode at least 15 times more proteins in the human genome. And the human genome has over 300 times as much DNA in its genome. And even the smallest chromosome, chromosome 21, is about 3 times as large as the entire Saccharomyces cerevisiae genome. So within our genome, about 1.5% to 2% of the genome contains mRNA genes, and about 10% encodes for these non-coding RNAs, which control the expression of other genes primarily. About 42% of the genome consists of transposons. So like maize has about 80% of its genome made of transposons, Ours is about 42%, and these have been very important in our evolution. And then the other 48% is other things, including introns and unknown regions of the genome. These include structural elements in the chromosomes, as well as many regions that just have not been fully characterized. The genomes of Caenorhabditis, that is a nematode, humans, and Drosophila, fruit flies, and yeast, have been compared, and these are just comparing the gene regions, not the non-genic regions. And so between a fungus and the animals, there's about 25% of the genes are in common among those organisms. But then among worms or nematodes, humans, and flies, about 68% is in common with those animals. So a high percentage of genes are in common. And then out here you have other genes that are just common between humans and flies, and nematodes and humans, etc., making up the total percentage of genes in those organisms. So only a small percentage really makes them unique in each case. Also, if you just compare the chromosomes, and here's a comparison between human chromosomes and mouse chromosomes, and then you try to find homologous regions among those chromosomes. So if we just take chromosome 1 here in humans, those same regions are found on chromosome 1 of mouse chromosomes, chromosome 4 in mouse chromosomes, and a little tiny bit in chromosome 8. And if you go to chromosome 2, there's a part in chromosome 1, there's a little part in chromosome 2, and a couple of other sections in other chromosomes. So the genes themselves are still there in all those organisms, but they've been rearranged. And this creates speciation also, because at mitosis and meiosis, those chromosomes have to line up. And if they don't line up, then you don't get a viable offspring from those. But in general, as organisms become more diverse within a population and then eventually speciate, the sequences on each of those chromosomes is about the same. You have some differences in alleles, which makes the differences in diversity and eventually speciation. But one thing that really affects speciation is then changes in the chromosome structure, movement of one piece of one chromosome to another chromosome, or splitting a chromosome. You also can notice that the X and Y chromosomes here don't change much, and that's true of most organisms, that they're the last ones to exhibit any kind of major change. So here's a phylogenetic tree on the right over here, and we're right in this group here with the apes and chimpanzees. And then on the left, this is a tree showing the splits in those various chains. So placental mammals back here, and about 5 million years ago, or 4 million years ago, the line that became the hominins, that is the human-like organisms, split from chimps and gorillas. So that's a time of about 4 to 5 million years ago. And some of the first hominins, that is human-like creatures, not hominids, which include the gorillas and chimps, but the hominins, became Ardipithecus and Australopithecus species. And out of that group came the first Homo species, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, etc., which then about 1 million years ago split into a couple of different groups, the Homo erectus group and the group that would become Homo heidelbergensis, which then split further to become the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, the humans. And the Homo sapiens have been around for approximately 200,000 years. And they have hybridized with other Homo species at least several times, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Darwin wrote on this topic in 1871 when he published The Descent of Man, and all the fossils human fossils were not known at that time, so a lot of these species that preceded Homo sapiens were not known. But actually he was ridiculed pretty heavily at the time to be some sort of ape man, because that's how some people interpreted his book, instead of taking it as a scientific look at where Homo sapiens originated. And even today, people totally misrepresent human evolution. So here's one where you have a monkey evolving into a chimp, evolving into some sort of pre-human, and then the humans at the end, when it really isn't a straight line like this. And then we have the sort of the joke ones where the chimpanzee then evolves into something like a human reading a book and eventually sitting down reading a computer. So not really the most accurate depictions. So here's a more accurate depiction where down at the bottom here we have the first organisms that started to look human-like. And that's Ardipithecus, back around 4.5 to 5 million years ago. Moving up into the Australopithecines, Australopithecus afarensis was around for actually quite a long time, almost 1 million years. And then into the Homo species over here, culminating here with Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, originating out of a line of Heidelbergensis. And there's another line over here that's not really well resolved, of another set of skulls that have been found. And here's a different depiction of the same sort of story. Here's genus Ardipithecus that was again around 4.5 million years ago, and then Australopithecus. Those species that genus was very successful for several million years. And then eventually coming out of one line of Australopithecus were the Homo species, including Homo sapiens. And you can see we've only been around for a very short time, only 200,000 years, where some of these other species lasted for close to 1 million years for some of them. And over here is a phylogram indicating those times when you first get Ardipithecus around 4 to 5 million years ago. And then going into these other, there's Australopithecus here, and then Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo sapiens, and Heidelbergensis. This diagram also shows some of the skulls and some of the body types of each one. So there's quite a bit of diversity and variation in these species. Bone structure. It's also been looked at as far as the skulls and the jaws, etc., whether they could vocalize the same way modern humans can. And in most cases, their vocalizations were probably much simpler than what we have now. And this is the same diagram that was on the right, just expanding that a little bit to show you the difference between hominids and hominins. So the hominids include bonobos, chimpanzees, and apes. And the hominins are the ones that are most human-like. So these are starting with Ardipithecus and then through Australopithecus. Paranthropus is another one that's sometimes placed in there, and then the genus Homo down here. And again, you should note the difference in stature of these different species. This is a map of some of the sites where bones from ancient humans have been found. This one here, the Olduvai Gorge, is where they found Lucy, which is a member of the Homo genus that's about 3.2 million years old. So the genus Homo originated at least that far back. And then these regions in here in Europe are primarily Heidelbergensis and Neanderthalensis, as well as Homo sapien skeletons that have been unearthed and studied. However, if you look throughout Africa, you can find quite a few different bones of ancient humans from different ages. Some of the oldest remains of humans have been found in Africa, indicating that this is the likely origin of Homo sapiens. There also have been remains found in Asia, including Indonesia, as well as throughout China and Vietnam and Cambodia, those areas. But those are always younger, which also indicates some of the earliest migrations of humans across the world. So here are a few reconstructions, artist reconstructions of some of the species. So up here are the Australopithecines, a couple of different ones. So these are some of the earliest human-likes or hominins. And then Paranthropus was a little later, going off of a different line. And then you have the species of within the genus Homo, including Homo habilis that actually survived quite a while. Homo erectus, who also occurred early on but lasted a very long time. And that evolved, one line evolved into Heidelbergensis that then split into Neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens. And then this line, Rhodesiensis, sort of split off on a different line about the same time. So here's a timeline of some of the different species of hominins, starting with Australopithecines over here, starting off around 3 to 4 million years ago, and then some of those evolving into different species of Homo. Homo erectus lasted a very long time. Nelidae also lasted a long time, and then some of those lines split off to become Heidelbergensis, which then split into Neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens. And it's clear that these also hybridized. They evolved at about the same time, and their ranges crossed also, and there were hybridization events. And we can still see that in the human genome today. So 3 different species of humans are known to have existed at the same time on Earth in slightly different locations, although Neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens had ranges that crossed one another. But then there's this Homo floresiensis, which is a much smaller human that evolved on an island. So the only remains of these are found on an island. And usually when organisms move to an island and remain on an island for a while, because of scarce resources, they become smaller and smaller. So this one certainly became much smaller, although it coexisted with these other 2 species. And note also that the cranium volume, the inner volume of the cranium, is larger in Neanderthals than it is with Homo sapiens. So we aren't the Homo species that had the largest brain. Actually, Neanderthals had a larger brain than we have. So I guess it is possible that Neanderthals in some ways could have been smarter than Homo sapiens. However, they went extinct around 40,000 years ago. By several million years ago, a species of Homo existed in several parts of the world, primarily Africa, around and in Asia, and some of the Indonesian islands, including Homo habilis here, Homo erectus, which you can see is much larger, and then that small human, the Homo floresiensis, that existed just on an island. And by about 2 to 3 million years ago, certain individuals within Homo habilis and Rudolfensis seem to have hybridized into a new species. And then Homo erectus emerged from that group, as well as Heidelbergensis. And it's unclear exactly the split here also, but it is clear that from Heidelbergensis then you get Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. Back further then again are Australopithecus, Ardipithecus, and this Paranthropus on this other branch of the Australopithecine line. A couple of different graphs here. The top graph shows the mean sea level and also the temperature of the atmosphere on Earth. So the genus Homo has been existent again around 2 to 3 million years. And during that time, the temperature has been relatively low compared to previous to that in the time of Australopithecus and Ardipithecus. The temperature was between 4 and 6 and perhaps 8 degrees centigrade warmer than it is now. And previous to that, it was even warmer, but no humans or hominins existed at that time. The sea level changes became important because as you get the encroachment of the ocean, the humans had to move inland, and as you get drying out of the oceans, mainly during ice ages, because that soaked up much of the water into ice, then they had to move back towards the coast or find water somehow, find some way to get resources. So it affected their migrations in many ways, including opening up land bridges when the sea level dropped so they could migrate further distances. During the time that Homo sapiens has been on Earth, right here, from 200,000 years to the present, it also coexisted with Floresiensis, Neanderthalensis, Homo erectus, and Homo denisovia. So there were hybridization events that we know of now that occurred among these species. So Homo sapiens has formed hybrids with other species, and for instance, a lot of the European population has between 2 and 4% Neanderthal genes in them, and other groups have, it looks like, Homo erectus genes within their genomes as well. So we've hybridized several times. Also, during the time humans first emerged, Homo sapiens, the climate was relatively mild. And then it cooled down because the levels of CO2 went down, and that drops the temperature. Then there was a rise in the temperature and CO2 levels, and then a slow decline up until the last ice age. And again, many of these ice ages then caused sea levels to drop and land bridges to form, and then humans again migrated. This time Homo sapiens migrated further distances. And for the last 10,000 years, temperatures have been rising, and more recently, in the last 200 years, and especially in the last 100 years, CO2 levels and temperatures have been rising much more rapidly. And we still don't really have a grasp on how that's going to affect the human populations. So in the next few slides, I just want to discuss a bit about the stature and other characters of some of these species. Here are a few comparative profiles and a little bit on the skull structure or brain cavity as well, showing that Ardipithecus and Australopithecus were about a foot or so shorter than modern humans. And also the brain case, where their brain was a lot smaller as well. So 4 to 5 million years ago, this was the first branch that led to the hominins. And you can see this is Ardipithecus, and 4 to 5 million years ago, he had longer arms and hands, and then shorter legs than modern humans. Sort of some of the characteristics of modern apes, but then many characteristics of modern humans as well. The next step on these branches leading towards the genus Homo is Australopithecus, and they lived from about 1 million to 4.4 million years ago. And you can see you're getting more human-like features, including shorter arms, smaller hands, and although you can't see it from this, a larger brain cavity as well. Then one branch off of the Australopithecus line led to Homo erectus and Homo habilis, starting about 2.5 million years ago. And you can see there's more human features, but quite a bit of difference in stature between Homo habilis, which was the earlier human Homo species, and then Homo erectus that appeared later, about 2 million years ago. This phylogram shows those ages going from Homo habilis about 2.5 million years ago, its arrival, and then Homo erectus about 1.8 to 2 million years ago. And from those, then there are lines leading off to Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthalensis, and finally Sapiens. So both of these, Heidelbergensis and Neanderthalensis, if you came upon them in a foreign country or something, you might look at them and think that they were modern humans, because they truly have modern human features by this time. And in fact, Neanderthalensis had a larger brain cavity than what Homo sapiens now has. And in this depiction, you see Homo habilis down here, about 2 to 2.5 million years ago, erectus emanating from that group by about 1.8 to 2 million years ago. And then there are these enigmatic fossil remains of humans that are found over here, including Floresiensis, which finally went extinct only about 20 to 30,000 years ago. And then up into this group with Naledi, Sapiens, Heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovians. And these lines also merge up at the top because we find a lot of hybridization between these different groups. And so there were hybridizations between Sapiens, Neanderthals and Denisovians and Sapiens, and probably others, including these lines here of Homo erectus, possibly hybridizing with Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens formed many admixtures, that is, hybrids with other species and varieties of humans, including an admixture from Africa, which moved out into the Arabian Peninsula, and possibly interbred with Neanderthals over here. And then you have an admixture down here, also hybridizing with the Denisovian group that came from up here in Asia, and possibly with Homo erectus too, and then moved down into Australia, Indonesia, etc. And then another mixture over here, which has some unique alleles that people still don't know where that archaic human came from, or where they were at very early on. But some of them moved over into the Arabian Peninsula and into the Middle East. Then there was a Neanderthal mixture there, a Neanderthal mixture there with Homo sapiens. Both of those groups, one group moved towards Europe, the other group moved into Asia. And then there are humans that eventually moved up from there along the East Asian area, and probably hybridized up in that area as well. So here's another diagram of some of those hybridization events. We know that there was a lot of mixing among different groups of humans in Africa early on, including some down in South Africa. And then there was a hybridization event here between Homo sapiens and some other human species, Homo species, possibly Heidelbergensis, possibly Erectus, possibly Neanderthalensis. It's unknown at this point where those alleles came from. Then there was a movement over into the Arabian Peninsula, certainly between Homo sapiens and Neanderthalensis. And then moving over further, another hybridization event with the Denisovians. And then another event over here between Homo sapiens and possibly Homo erectus. And then finally another one between Homo sapiens and Neanderthalensis again in Europe. So, and there probably were more than is indicated here. From the fossil evidence, including skulls and skeletons and footprints, by about 1.7 million years ago, several species of hominins were present in East Africa. In southern Africa, there were Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, and Paranthropus. Further north, then you get most of those except Australopithecus, and a new species appears, and that's Homo erectus. And furthermore, other skeletal remains have been found up in northeastern Africa, in the parts of the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East. So they were migrating already at that time, 1.7 million years ago. By 800,000 years ago, then Homo erectus had migrated over to the northwest coast of Africa, as well as parts of Asia, Sumatra, and Indonesia, and into Europe. And a different species, antecessor, was also found in Western Europe, but then went extinct shortly thereafter. About 200,000 years ago, then, there was this new species, Homo sapiens, that emerged out of the Homo heidelbergensis line, and Neanderthals also did. So by 125,000 years ago, then, there was a large range here in eastern and northern Africa of the late heidelbergensis species, as well as early Homo sapiens, and also Neanderthals had expanded throughout Europe and parts of Asia, and they kind of pushed out Homo erectus into Asia, especially Eastern Asia, and Indonesia as well. Also note that this was the first emergence of Homo sapiens outside of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. By 40,000 years ago, there had been several migrations of Homo sapiens out of Africa, including one that went into Asia, into Indonesia, and eventually into Australia, another migration that went up into Europe, and there was mixing then between the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And then up in northern Asia, the Denisovians, which may have been an offshoot of the Neanderthals, also were present in North Asia and mixed. There were hybridizations between the Homo sapiens and the Denisovians as well. Then, around 15,000 years ago, Homo sapiens finally migrated into the Americas, first into North America and then a little later into South America. And it seems to have been one migration across the land bridge during a time of glaciation when the sea level dropped. And there are two hypotheses and maybe two routes. One was a land route through Canada into the current U.S., and the other is a possible ocean route using boats at that time. And both seem to be plausible, so it's unsure whether it was one migration or two, and the route that they took is a little bit uncertain. Also note that most of the other Homo species by this time have gone extinct. So Neanderthalensis, the Denisovians are gone. There are remains of Homo floresiensis on an island from that time period. So it is possible that a few remnants of some other Homo species remained 15,000 years ago. But most of the Homo species on Earth at that time were all Homo sapiens, including admixtures, that is, hybrids of Homo sapiens and others, including Erectus and Neanderthalensis and Denisovians. So although those other species are now extinct, some of their genes from some of the species still remain within the Homo sapiens genomes. And then by 4,000 years ago, humans started moving not only by land but across oceans. So you have things like Madagascar, first populated by about 1,500 years ago, islands in the Arabian Peninsula area were colonized, and then the Canary Islands about 3,000 years ago, and then Polynesia about 3,500 years ago, and moving further out from that, Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island. So they were traveling by not only by land, but there was a lot of ocean travel as well, and ocean migration. And although they are all Homo sapiens at the root, they all developed slightly different cultures and languages that tended to evolve as well, culturally and socially. So we know about these movements not only by archaeology and looking at skulls and things from the past and dating those, but also through molecular means. So this was a study done a few years ago where they took DNA from many, many different native people from around the world, and then made a phylogram of that that was rooted to, I think, chimpanzee. So that's way back here at the beginning. So you can see on this side of the phylogram, almost all of these on this side are from Africa, both central, western, and eastern Africa. And then you pick up some Asians. So there was an early migration out of Africa, as I said, into Asia. And then you have some deep roots again here. Again, these are Africans, Africa down here, and then finally into Asians and Papua New Guinea Asians, and finally some Europeans. And recall that even the Europeans and then some of the Asians had already mixed with Neanderthals, so these are probably a lot of hybrids over here. And then finally into other areas of Asia and Europe. Here's a different way of looking at it, and so these are looking at mitochondrial DNA haplotypes. So you inherit your mitochondrial DNA from your mother, and so you can trace where essentially the females went during that time. And so you can see in Africa there are a lot of haplotypes that are similar. This green type, which probably was one of the original types, and then a couple of other haplotypes that start appearing on the eastern side of Africa. And then some of these haplotypes, not all of them, but some subsets of that population moved over through Asia and then into Australia. Others went a little further over into Asia. And then another set of haplotypes went into Central Asia or Eurasia up here, and then apparently this is where a lot of the Europeans came from. Some of those haplotypes or some of the subpopulations moved then over into Western Europe and Western Europe. So this is an interesting migration map also, indicating movement of the mitochondrial DNA, which follows the females around, as well as the Y chromosome, which will follow the males around. So you can see by and large, you get many of the migrations of the females don't quite match some of the migrations of the males. So there were some differences in where those different haplotypes, both the mitochondrial haplotypes and the Y chromosome haplotypes moved, although it's clear that the beginning was in Africa. I think some of the movements of the Y chromosomes by water probably, and then mixing with extant populations in those areas explains why there were some movements that seemed to be primarily the males donating essentially their genetic material to those populations where they migrated. So here's a map of some of those migrations. As I stated before, and that's pretty much what agreed, that the population of humans between about 130,000 years ago and about 200,000 years ago was concentrated in Africa. And then there was an initial movement some 60 to 70,000 years ago into southern Asia, in through India, and then another migration across a land bridge through Indonesia into Australia, which also occurred about 60 to 70,000 years ago. And part of this migration into Australia was due to the fact that it was an ice age era when the sea levels were lower and there was a land bridge across that area, and they could walk almost all the way or all the way into Australia. And so climate had a lot to do with when these migrations occurred also, whether it was a warm period and the oceans were higher, or a cold period when the oceans levels, the sea levels, were much lower. Between 40 and 50,000 years ago, then humans or Homo sapiens started moving out of Africa into Europe, into Central Europe, into Asia, and then by 25 to 35,000 years ago, they had reached all the way over to Japan and Korea and those areas, and a possible migration into North America during that time as well. Later, there were migrations into North America, both eastern and western side, that occurred between 12 and 15,000 years ago, possibly as long ago as 16 to 17,000 years ago. And then those same humans, although they had established settlements and civilizations through North America and Central America, also moved down through South America too. It seems to be the same migration, essentially migration further south. And then a final migration 7,000 to 9,000 years ago into northern Canada, or northern North America, which are the Inuits. As humans moved into different regions of the world, large animals, that is megafauna, became extinct. So in Australia, that occurred about 50,000 years ago as Homo sapiens moved in there. In North America, around 11,000 years ago. In Madagascar, around 15,000 years ago. And in New Zealand, about 700 years ago. So that coincides with the migrations and population increases of Homo sapiens in those regions. And one thing that may have caused this is our big brains, right? So humans could hunt cooperatively with other humans, but also a larger brain means that you need more protein. And so they had to actually eat more to survive. So here's a graph just illustrating those extinctions. So here's the populations of large animals, and then Homo sapiens enters the continent at each of these arrows, and you can see in Africa the numbers of large megafauna tend to drop after that, in Australia especially, in North America also, and then in Madagascar also. Just difference in the timing. But shortly after humans populate an area, the populations of megafauna drop drastically sometimes. And currently we're within what is being called the sixth major extinction, and much of the extinction is caused by humans moving into newer and newer areas and destroying different habitats for many, many different species of organisms. So this is another outcome of evolution, really, as one species becomes very successful, that is Homo sapiens, it's at the expense of other species. And that brings up another point. during the time that Homo sapiens has been on Earth. At the same time, shown in blue up here, there have been at least 7 or 8 other species of Homo that have existed or coexisted with Homo sapiens. However, Homo sapiens is now the only species within that genus that's remaining extant or remaining alive. So the question is, what happened to the other species of Homo? And some people believe, and I'm not sure if it's been quite established, that Homo sapiens themselves wiped out the other species because of competition. Although in some cases it may have been either a lack of food resources or diseases that wiped out some of the other species. It's not completely established yet. So what's the future for our species? Currently there's a population explosion that's been going on for extensively for the last 50 years, and it's clear that we're going to either poison ourselves with pollution or run out of resources, and some places have already run out of resources. Pandemics like the one that we're having right now could wipe out a large proportion of the population. Climate change is a danger that's sort of lurking in the background all the time. Lack of genetic variation, probably not. And so if we go back to Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, looking at the evolution of humans, about, I guess, 30, 40 years ago, Jacob Bronowski wrote this book, The Ascent of Man, that was looking at the technological advances of humans. And he brought up some of the same points that will technology sort of save humans, or in the end, will it be the demise of humans, or won't we be able to save ourselves? I think it's still a question today, even though the book was written 50 years ago. So I want to just leave you with a few items here about the future for humans and evolution of humans. One thing that's clear right now is the population on Earth has really exponentially grown in the past 50 years especially. And so it's clear that it can't go on like that forever, and that's jeopardized some parts of human civilization. It's increased the number of wars around the world, and it's increased global climate change due to pollution, and including pollution of fresh water and oceans. So global climate change and the fact that we're polluting the earth at even faster rates has to lead to some changes along the way, and some of those changes may not be so comfortable for the human species. Also, things that can affect things rapidly are asteroids, volcanism, and gamma ray bursts, as well as pandemics. So these are things that are either unpredictable or somewhat unpredictable or partly predictable, but they can affect things in a great way in a very short amount of time. And we've already seen this in a small way at this point in time anyway with the coronavirus pandemic. It is affecting things worldwide. It's affecting human populations all over the world currently. And there are other things, unrecognized hazards that will come up in the future. So the average length of time when a species is alive on Earth is about 500,000 to 1 million years, and Homo sapiens has been on Earth for about 200,000 years, and it's not guaranteed that the species will live on another 200,000 years. So although we try to control things in a technological way, and we do sometimes, natural forces are always going to affect whether a species survives or does not. Okay, thank you very much, and I will talk to you later.